For part 3 in this series, Bob Into Buildings, we start a tour of Castle Rushen in Castletown, managed by Manx National Heritage for the Nation, and I asked Alison Fox from MNH, who visits the castle on a regular basis, if she still has a strange frisson on entering the castle.
Yeah, I still do every time, really, and I'm at the castle fairly regularly. There are 2 entrances into the castle. There's the one in the winter when the site's closed to the public that the staff use, which is the small sallyport door to the left of the main door as you're facing it. But the main door that we come in the summer and all the public come into, which takes you up the what we call the Barbican, you can't help but just get a little shiver every time you walk up there, just thinking, there's always still this, should we really be here? Because that's what the castle's about. We shouldn't.
It's to keep people out.
It's absolutely to keep people out, and that's the work we've done recently has reinforced our belief in that's exactly what the castle was built for. You're not welcome, unless you've got specific permission. You can keep out, and we're trying to obviously do the opposite of that. It was also there to impress, wasn't it? It's very much a big stone status symbol in the landscape as well, and I think it's it can be quite difficult to visualise what the Isle of Man was like at, say, the end of the 1400s, when the castle was pretty much at the height it is now. But if you think about what was in the surrounding landscape, there wasn't a great deal. There was certainly no buildings of this scale. Rushen Abbey was kind of around about the same time, so you'd had the Castle Rushen, the big stone tower in the landscape. Further up the Silverburn, you'd have Rushen Abbey, so you'd have the monks keeping the eye on the lords, and the other way around as well. So you'd have these 2 big, massive buildings, and then nothing really until you got up to Bishop's Court in the north. And then that's from the land. But if you can imagine arriving by sea, and Derby Haven, as the name suggests, is one of the best natural ports around the island. So if people were coming in to the island or approaching, or even just passing to the south of the island, they would have seen Castle Rushen, and they'd have known that, okay, somebody with a bit of wherewithal lives there.
Before this chat, I went down to the harbour and stood there and imagined that all the little cottages weren't there. And it is impress. It says, as we have just said, keep out.
It does. I mean, there's no doubt that it was there for two main reasons: to keep people out and to keep whoever was in safe. Those are the 2 reasons. But also, alongside that, it's very much this marking territory, so that everybody knew somebody of great wealth, great importance, great influence owned the Isle of Man. It was somebody's.
We still, I think, don't know actually when it was built.
We don't. We had quite a comprehensive conservation management plan done a few years ago by Paul Drury, and he did a lot more research, a lot more looking as well at the structure of the castle, and we think we're looking at now a structure that was starting to be built, the first stone structure on site starting in the late 1100s. So we tend to round up to about AD 1200, which is, as I say, it's a little bit later than Rushen Abbey, but potentially you'd have the builders working on Rushen Abbey and Castle Rushen at the same time. And that's another thing that it's quite difficult to imagine as well. 800 years ago, all of a sudden these massive stone structures were going up. And we see Castle Rushen as a whole big structure now, but even once you start looking at it closely, the size of the stones in the wall, are absolutely huge. So, 800 years ago we're looking at, but, a really massive building project.
When you notice it, you realise that the Norse had actually learnt from the Normans, hadn't they?
We can see quite a lot of influences from the castles around that were around at this particular time. And when Castle Rushen first started, bear in mind that this was a little bit earlier than, for example, a big castle building programme in Wales. So this is, the beginnings of Castle Rushen were a little bit earlier than that. So yeah, it's very much the Norman influence in the architecture. We can see similar sort of layouts in Ireland, for example, for the way Castle Rushen began. But it is influenced, and that really goes back to the Viking kings, or King Reginald, who we think started the castle. They were very much influenced by the English crown. They were under the control of the Norwegian king still. The Isle of Man was part of the overall Norwegian kingdom at that time. But those Norse kings had, great influence, and they visited the English court a lot. So they would have had the influences from those particular areas.
Where does Magnus come into it then?
Depends which Magnus, really. I suppose, Olafsson. We have the first documented reference to Castle Rushen is in the Chronicles of the Kings of Man in the Isles, and they say that King Magnus died at Castle Rushen AD 1265, and that's the first reference we have to the castle. Magnus was the last king of the kingdom of Man in the Isles. He was the last in the line of the Viking kings, Norse kings that had sort of stretched back to Godred Crovan, really. And after the Vikings had basically been defeated by the Scots, then the Isle of Man held on to Viking rule for little bit longer. They basically did a deal that said the Isle of Man could remain part of the kingdom until the death of Magnus. So when Magnus died, then the whole of the kingdom of Man in the Isles did too.
And then it just swapped them backwards and forwards all the time between England and Scotland.
Yeah, we went through a period of certainly 100 years where, it must have been really chaotic, certainly in the upper levels of society. What normal people like you and I would have thought of it, I don't know, just sort of like, who is it this week? But, the Isle of Man was being passed from the English crown to the Scottish crown, not particularly because it was seen as a valuable piece of land in itself, but because the other didn't want the other one to get it. It was that time where, Robert the Bruce and the Scottish Wars of Independence were happening. So, the Isle of Man is such a strategic stronghold in the British Isles that's what that period was all about. It wasn't so much we want the Isle of Man, it's we don't want them to get the Isle of Man.
Is there evidence that Robert the Bruce actually came here?
Yeah, it says in the documentary sources that Robert the Bruce arrived at Ramsey, made his way down to Castletown and sieged the castle. What we don't know really is what form that siege took. We know that after he'd sieged the castle in 1313, there was a period when it looks as if the castle was neglected and fell into decay. And it was in the 1330s that we then start to see the castle being built back up again. Whether that neglect and decay was a direct result of damage inflicted by Robert the Bruce on the castle, we don't know. And he didn't really have a set pattern of what he did in other places. So some of the castles he completely, destroyed. Other castles he just, he besieged, but the buildings weren't actually damaged. So we can't really say for sure what kind of damage, but he certainly came here.
But 1330, it started going again.
Yeah, in the 1330s, we see a new person taking over the reins of the Isle of Man, William Montacute, and he's one of the characters we have in the castle here. There's a fabulous drawing of him in a manuscript called the Salisbury Roll, where it shows some of the leading families with their armorial dress, and he just looks fantastic. He's got these massive sort of griffin sort of decoration on the helmet, these big feathery plumes, and you can just imagine him rocking up in Castletown saying, right, okay, what everybody else was thinking.
I'm the boss.
Yeah, that's right, here I am, I'll sort your castle out for you. Just imagine what everybody else was thinking. But he arrived and he saw the importance of re-establishing the island as a strategic stronghold for, at that point, England. So from this point on, really, things began to be a little bit more settled. The island was under English control, and it was then that the castle really started taking shape into the shape and size that we see it today.
Today, we've got this wonderful entrance you referred to as the Barbican. Now, the dog leg in it is there for defensive purposes if people should deign to attack.
That's right, and again, it's coming back to those first principles. The castle was built to defend who was in and to keep out people they didn't want in. And so every part of the castle is designed with that in mind. So the barbican has this dog leg so that you can't, in the fantastic Hollywood medieval films when they're charging across the drawbridge or, battering down the door, the barbican was designed with this angle in it so people couldn't do that. That was a real threat, so that people couldn't just charge up and attack. So there's many different levels of defence in the castle. The barbican is the first one from this side, but then you leave that, then you've got to get through a gatehouse, then you've got to get over the drawbridge, then you've got to get through another gatehouse. So they weren't interested in making things easy.
This is the gatehouse we're in at present. Would have this been where the troops or the defenders were housed?
They would have had some quarters in here. This is what we call the outer gatehouse. This is where our ticket base and the current shop is now. And it's actually, you just see it as one story, but there's actually 2 stories to it. And there would have been rooms where the guards on duty would have been able to keep warm, fireplaces and things like that. And there could have been accommodation in the room above us. Most of the garrison, certainly as we sort of go on through time, most of the garrison would have been in the middle bit, in the keep itself, and that's where we see more evidence for the domestic quarters.
Is there evidence here going back to the films, the Hollywood films, they're always pouring oil on them and things like that. Is there evidence of that here in Castle Rushen?
We've certainly got the mechanism for them to have done that. We have what we call the murder holes, which is clues in the name, I guess, isn't it? As you go through into the keep and through what we call the inner gatehouse, if people look up, they can see sort of square holes in the ceiling above them, and that would have provided spaces for people to throw down whatever they had to hand. I think
you dread to think, don't you?
Yeah, you can. Let's not get the imagination going too much on that, but basically anything that would have stopped or at least slowed down anybody who they thought was trying to gain entry that they didn't want them to.
Let's keep wandering then, shall we? So we go through the gift shop and the outer guardhouse. So this is what, a moat?
It kind of looks that way now. Originally we think the moat would have been further out. So again, the castle as we see it today never really happened in one fell swoop, if you like. We've got as we stand here and look at the keep itself, look at the drawbridge, the original stone foundations, the earliest courses of stonework that you can see are around about AD 1200. The bulk of it is then 1300s with some additions, certainly internally a lot of changes later on. If we look sort of further around at the castle complex, we've got this, the wall walks, as we call them, around the keep, and then we also have the glacis, which is outside, which is the thing you drive.
I know what that is. No, remember that word.
The grassy covered, grassy covered bank there. That was put in the 1500s. Along with actually a certain proportion of the barbican. So it wasn't all built as one, and we think actually the moat originally was further out, so perhaps not quite on the line where the glacis is now, but more in that level.
And would that have been filled with water?
Yeah, presumably. I mean, we've got the road right in front of the castle, the road that goes round most of the castle, but up until that road was built in when was that, 1700, late 1700s, early 1800s, that this side of the castle would have just gone straight down into where the harbour is now, so there would have been a certain amount of tidal water going around. It certainly would have been a very boggy area, and anybody who knows their Monty Python films know that building a castle in a swamp is actually it is another form of defence as well. If you get nice soft boggy ground, again it slows those people down that you don't want now.
We'll speed up then. If we go across the bridge or where the moat possibly was, we're now coming to this wonderful edifice, and yeah, where would castles be without portcullises?
It can't be a good portcullis or three, as we've got in the outer gatehouse, and we've got these two here. These are modern, modern, over 100 years old now.
Sorry, man's just shouted at us through an O.
Again, that's castles for you.
So we're looking at these. This is just mighty, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's one of the things that it can be very, because people are so used to buildings like Castle Rushen, Rushen Abbey, Peel Castle. We see them so often; they're sort of just part of who we are and what we do. You know, everybody on the island. We sometimes just don't look at them, and I think when you enter Castle Rushen, when you come over that drawbridge, and if you just stop where we're stood now in the sort of little shelter bit here, and we look up, we see the murder holes, we see the modern replicas of the portcullises either side of us. It's a really grim place to be. And it, again, going back to its purpose, it wasn't built as a nice place to be, and sometimes I think it's it's good just to stop and actually look at the detail in the castle.
It must have been because basically the people who fought through this area were the cannon fodder, weren't they? Just go and invade and see if we can get into the castle.
Yeah, and before that arrow fodder, it's you're always looking at putting the people in first, and the same way with the castle. It would have always been the troops going in first, the troops being sent in first, and especially before cannon, in the early years, certainly in the 1200s and into the 1300s even, when cannon wasn't so common in use, then it was human power, and it was manpower. Pretty much it's how close you could get, and we've already talked about the numbers of defences here, so the chances are you're not going to get very close, really.
Just madness to even try and invade, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think so, but then
that didn't stop kings.
No, it didn't. That's how kings got to be kings. That's how they got in our history books, I guess.
So we wander through under the portcullises, and now this is the bulk of the building, isn't it? And as you were saying earlier, the sizes of some of those stones.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's just that trying to see the trees for the wood, isn't it? It's looking at the detail, and these are they're massive stone blocks, limestone, just quarried from probably round Scarlet. So they haven't come a long way, but there's an awful lot of them. In some parts, the walls of the castle are certainly 4 foot up to 6 foot thick. That's a massive. In some places double walled as well. And again, here we can sort of see how it wasn't, the castle building wasn't built in one go. In some areas in here you can see the very earliest pieces of the stonework. A lot of this has been changed when the castle became a prison in the later stages, and we'll see a bit more of that once we go inside.
Talking of that, let's go inside, shall we?
We are stood at the top of what we call the prison staircase. This was put in when the castle became the island's prison. It had been used as a prison for a good few years, but in the early 1800s they started making pretty substantial structural changes to the inside of the castle to accommodate prisoners. We are stood on the top of the staircase, which people come to when they come out of the medieval dining room, where the guys are there having their suckling pig and castles filled with custard. Yeah, we missed that, sorry. So the visitors come out onto the staircase. This staircase was put in around about 1815, something like that. And originally, there would not have been any staircase here at all, so it would have just been one single floor. This would only have been accessed by one spiral staircase. So at the moment, visitors go up one spiral staircase, they go across, and they come down another. But originally, they couldn't have accessed this side of the castle from the ground floor like we've just done.
Okay, but we've nipped up the stairs pretty quickly. You can see in that access there, I should imagine that has been put in, has it? From the original.
It has, and this is one of the things about Castle Rushen, which makes it so special, so interesting, but so incredibly frustrating at times. It's just so complicated. I'm an archaeologist. I'm not a buildings historian. I'm not an architectural historian, and you know, to just try and get your head around what's been put in here when and what's been taken away is really difficult. But that doorway that leads to what we call the Lord's Great Chamber now was put in during the prison period when the prison staircase was put in. So again, there would have been some division. It might have been a wooden division, because the room that we see beyond that we call the Treasury, which is the most secure room in the most secure building in the Isle of Man.
Surprise!
Yeah. So that's where all the good stuff and documents and legal documents would have been kept.
Prisoners, there are one or two well-known prisoners that were kept here.
Yeah, we've got a lot of records from the prison period. We have the day books of Dr. John Clegg, who was the prison surgeon here for a good number of years, and he talks about many of the prisoners. Some of his notings are really good. You know, sort of like the underlying. You know, he was very ill. He was put in solitary confinement and suddenly became much better. You know, there's this lovely sort of tone, you know, to some of it. But yeah, and we have of course we have the last man to be hanged on the Isle of Man was held here at Castle Rushen, and indeed hanged here as well.
But ecclesiastically, I think, wasn't Wilson held here?
Bishop Wilson, yes, we have Bishop Wilson, well, at least his mannequin, in one of the cells downstairs. He got into trouble because he had a bit of an altercation or a bit of a disagreement with the governor's wife, which ended up him being put in prison. But there was a massive outcry. He was a very popular figure. As with everybody, you know, there are two sides to every story. But you know, there was outcry when he was imprisoned, and he was eventually released.
That cell in Peel Castle still gives me the shudders.
Yeah, how can it not? It's
it's awful,
there is
isn't it?
there's you know, just the thought of being just put in there for however long.
No, don't like that idea. The Lord's Great Chamber. Shall we wander into that? So we're into a very gloomy room.
Yes, it is. It is now. It's not it's an unusual day where it's quite grey and rainy, so we haven't got a huge amount of daylight. But you know, that was life in a medieval castle. You know, you would have had to bring your own lights in with you. You know, you wouldn't have been expected to just wander around on your own and have the rooms lit ready for you. Likewise, in this particular room, we have some of the painted wall hangings that you'll see in a few rooms around the castle. And again, these wouldn't have been here necessarily all of the time. A lot of the time with the castles, when they were first built, Castle Rushen was no exception. They weren't permanent homes for the rulers, so Castle Rushen was built as a base for the Viking kings to start with, then the Lords of Man. They didn't spend a lot of time over here, usually. So if you had room decoration like these painted cloths, you could basically, the Lord's coming, you know, you get a few days' notice.
Let's do some dusting.
That's right, you know, it's not just a case of flying in or you know, getting them bananing over. So you had a few days ready, a few days preparation time to get ready, and you could just unroll the cloths, put them up, and make the castle look, you know, absolutely fabulous and everything like that again. So again, sort of just going back to the gloominess, I guess, you know, people were, that was life, you know, and so it's gloomy to us now, but you know, again, you know, we would have been carrying our own little lights around, or preferably having somebody carry them for us.
That's the best way, isn't
right,
it?
Yes.
Okay. So what's through that door over there?
So that room there is what we call the Treasury now.
Well, let's go in there then. Because it is gloomy, because the windows don't look out, do they? They look over the courtyard.
They do, and again, that's one of the design techniques for building a castle. You know, it's not designed for you to live in and have a nice view over the sea. You don't need a nice view over the sea. What you need your soldiers to be able to do is look to make sure nobody's sneaked into the courtyard, or you want your soldiers to be at the very top in all weathers and to give you a warning if you happen to be here that somebody's coming in. Yeah. So you don't need to look out.
No,
don't you worry about that.
No. So no balconies. No. Okay. Right. No. Carrying on, we've come to the Treasury now. Gosh, yes. Wouldn't like to spend too much time in here.
No, this was used, as the name suggests, probably as a place to store any particular bits of wealth, but also important documents as well in the medieval period, so in the 1300s. 1400s. It is only accessed through the doorway off the Great Chamber, which is only accessed through the medieval dining room from the other spiral staircase. So it is the most secure room in the most secure building on the Isle of Man, I would say.
Would somebody have spent all their time in here, a treasurer?
I don't think so. I think it was more a room of things where things were kept.
Like a safe?
Yes, yeah, essentially. And, again, if we sort of think of the precious things as being documents as well, if you think of the modern day equivalent of a Rolls office, perhaps, something like that. So there wouldn't have necessarily been anybody in here all the time. And again, going back to the first principles, you wouldn't necessarily need anybody in all the time because you didn't have people like us just wandering about. You had a very select number of people who
would have been shot
by
now, wouldn't we?
Well shot by now, yeah.
They didn't build small rooms either, did they? They were all tall.
They were, yeah. I think it's a bit like the prehistoric buildings, isn't it? You sort of, if you ever get to go in a replica of a prehistory replica of a building, they all seem very small. But I think it's just with castles. I think it's an architectural thing. You've got plenty of space to move around, and also you're working with very big stone, as well. Yeah. So it's. And again, it goes back to that status thing as well. You're if you do have guests, they're under no illusions that they're in somewhere very special.
Very special indeed. That concludes the first part of a tour of Castle Rushen with Alison Fox from Manx National Heritage. Mark Tiley is next with Greatest Hits. Join me again on April the 11th for the fourth programme in the series. If you want to listen again to tonight's programme about Castle Rushen, please use Manx Radio's webpage and also check out the podcast. Till next time, goodbye.